I am an INTJ, and I decided to start this video channel about chess. I will be showing games of my own, games from top grandmasters, as well as going over tactical puzzles that are more difficult, such as endgame studies. I do hope to reach the National Master title within the next 2 years. I'm currently a Class A strength player, so hopefully this should be somewhat manageable. I'd like to start off my inaugural video by showing a game with one of my close friends and a collaborator who's about 1950 strength. So I had the white pieces and I played the English. So we're going to start off with my variation that I play. It allows quick control over the light squares in the diagonal here. White is usually going to play something like e4 after bishop g2 and knight e2 to break with either d4 or f4 at some point. So we respond with knight blocking the diagonal here. Develop the bishop, and this move gives the plan here with the bishop on g2 a little bit of a problem. It controls this e4 square quickly and early on, so it's going to be difficult to play this e4 idea. So instead, white is going to have to adjust to this idea, the new Anglo-Dutch that we have on the board here, and we have to try for immediate pawn break instead. So that's either going to be d4 or f4. It's just we're not going to be playing e4 first. So instead, f4 probably isn't going to work because we're going to cede control over the center. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off, just develop a minor piece, get back in the game, and d3. We're going to continue controlling the light squares, but as you'll see in just a minute here, we are going to prepare for a d4 break right here. So this is made substantially more difficult by the fact that black has developed his bishop to c5 here. Now, about that, we're going to have to figure out a way to get rid of the 3 square control we have over here on d4, because here we're only going to have, about 2 pieces that are going to be able to contribute. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep developing. Knight ge2, so we're going to keep hitting this square, and we're going to castle real quick before we make a pawn break, because we don't want to leave our king in the center while opening up the position here. So we're going to castle, castle. Now, if we look, this is a Dutch, so black is trying to get quick development here and attack on the queen side, usually with a plan like this to try and initiate some form of checkmate. Alright, so I played a idea here to prepare the d4 break, which, as it turns out, does not need preparing. If we take a quick look at this, right, there we go. So if we look at this, now an idea like bishop b6 to draw back immediately won't be very strong, because then white has the center, controls the dark squares with his pawns, and still has light square restriction with his knight, pawn on c4, and this monster bishop on g2. Everything is just opening up in the position, which is great for white. All he needs to do is make sure that this bishop gets back into the game. So if we look at it, maybe an idea like this might happen. Then bishop is going to be forced to go back to b6 here. So if we look at this, white does have the center 2 pawns here, and black's pawns aren't doing so much here. This pawn is still restricting the movement of the light squared bishop, and this dark squared bishop here has now been freed up, so he could even go with an idea of bishop f4 here to further restrict the movement of this pawn so that this bishop has a difficult time getting out. He might have to try an idea like this to get the bishop in the game somehow. Okay? So now I did not play this, and I decided for the more preparatory move. So a3. So we're just going to go for this b4 idea here. Whoops. b4, and then we're going to go b5, which dislodges the knight, makes this diagonal even more important for the bishop to be on, and then this d4 break is going to be extremely strong here. So it's just a matter of choice on which type of move you want to play. But black counters with a5, really honing in on this b4 square weakness, because he has 3 pieces in on here. At best, I'm going to have 1 after I make this b4 break. So the idea is you need to get a piece on it, and you need to figure out how to deal with this center. Right, so rook b1. Now, queen h5. This creates a lot of counterplay on the king side for black. So black is looking to maybe make an f4 pawn stack, potentially at some point, opening up this view of the bishop here. And essentially he's just going to go for mating threats with typical Dutch ideas of rook lifts, rover, rook up and over. So essentially white has to make sure that there's no ideas of this happening whatsoever. So he's going to have to play quickly in the center and make pawn breaks with his pawns so that the pieces will, such as this bishop and the knight, get dislodged. Dangers might be that white has to watch out for would be that this knight can come over here and hop into the game to help support this f4 pawn break here. So he's going to have to make sure that this doesn't happen. So that's why d4 is such an important idea here. So I countered with this intriguing idea of b4. Now initially, let's take a look at this. So we make a pawn sacrifice at the cost of activity. So white is hoping now that this bishop is open up a little bit more to get back into the game, make some moves, and basically get his queen and this rook over on this over on this file here. So basically he's just going to be able to push all of his center pawns and see what happens. So now if we look at this, okay, d4, right? So if we look at any potential checkmate ideas, knight g4, we're just going to play h3 in response, and white has nothing to fear. Knight's going to have to go back here onto f6, and then white can play something like king h2 to defend, or even h4. The danger with h4 is you have to watch out for these g5 pawn pushes, which can suddenly open this file here on the h file, and then these rook lefts become especially dangerous as they allow the rook and queen easy access over to the king side to just create a battery and kill the king. So black has a couple of responses here that we can look at. He's got this take here on d4, which will get rid of one of the center pawns, but it still also helps to open this bishop up because there's no longer an idea of playing e4 to make sure that the bishop has no scope. So taking there can be considered a little bit dubious. Now another idea is to figure out what to do with this bishop. There's the old saying that loose pieces drop off. So the thing is, this pawn is about to move forward to d5, which does block off this bishop here, but after the knight moves, then this bishop here on b4 is still hanging, so the rook can be free to just take and everything's hunky-dory. So in this game, black decided to take on c3, which is okay, but now the thing is that white has the two bishops, and with this d4 break here, things are promising to open up within the position, so he doesn't have as much to worry about as white, even though he's a pawn down. Essentially, all white's pieces are going to become very active with these rooks on the b and the c file, and this bishop is going to find somewhere to hone in on, most likely coming to d2 before going anywhere else to decide where it best feels at home, whether it be on c3 or this nice a3, f8 diagonal. So we take back the bishop, and black did not want the queen trade here. Black decided that he wanted to keep some form of an attack going. This position after the knight takes, this diagonal here has opened up, permitting the queen trade. Now this is actually more favorable for black to allow the queen trade, as essentially he's just going to trade down and try to make use of his extra pawn. Now black decided against this because he wanted to keep some form of an attack going, so he went back to e8 here. So the idea is he's going to keep some central pressure here with the queen, and he's still going to try for ideas with the rook lift up and over it, and this bishop is still honing in on this area. Now the thing is, he doesn't have much time to do this because white's attack is coming fast. So if we look at the queen trade here, if it had actually happened, So rook is going to take here. We still have some pressure on the center here, but the queen is no longer able to occupy this diagonal as well, which is very strong, seeing as how the king is wide open. Also, the queen here and the rook place significant pressure on this pawn here, as the bishop can be considered immobile here. So, I'm going to go back here. Queen e8. So, knight b5 here. So we're going to quickly attack this pawn right here, and we're going to add pressure on the a7 square here, which might restrict any ideas of doubling here with the rook, or rook protecting this pawn. Also, this knight here enables take back here at any point with the knight if you want to further centralize your minor pieces, which is very important here, and it just opens up this long file here, which the queen or the rook can make use of later. So all in all, this knight is fine here. If it's attacked later with say a knight move here, and we're going to kick the knight like this, then we just come back here and we continue controlling these light squares right here, which is further improved by the continuing scope of this bishop right here. So here, okay, so we're going to develop the queen to defend the pawn. Bishop comes out. So the main idea here is this bishop is going to come to this very important b4 square here. Now if you notice, the queen and the rook are still here on this long diagonal, so this is quite dangerous. And the thing is, black really can't do much about it, because if he moves the rook, that really doesn't do what he wants it to do. It just wastes the tempo, because originally he wanted to move it to the f6 square to get some form of attack going. So the idea here is, essentially we're restricting the mobility of black's pieces. Black is reduced into passivity despite the fact that he's a pawn up, so we can use that as white to continue our attack and gain our pawn back most likely at some point, along with a great positional advantage. So black finally plays this e4 idea, so we're blunting this bishop. So something we have to keep in mind here is that f3 will be an idea later on. We're going to blow open this diagonal here. Pawn's most likely going to have to recapture after the capture here, and essentially this pawn will become very weak, as this c4 square still blocks the pawn on d6 here from moving forward. So what do? We continue developing our pieces. So queen here, we still attack this diagonal. King is put in check. So the main idea here is white is trying to fragment black's pawns. So if you look here, we've got this pawn structure here. As I mentioned before, this pawn is particularly immobile, and so is the bishop. So what we're trying to do is induce a recapture here, so that we have an isolated group of pawns here. Those will become weak targets that we can easily go after. So essentially the main idea is the c5 pawn break again. So white goes king h8 to get out of the diagonal. Here we make the move rook fc1. We're going to continue developing our rooks, put them on the files we want to. Now, knight d8. So this idea is very good. So the idea that I mentioned before, we're going to initiate the c6 break here, and the knight is going to be kicked. But black's follow-up did not mirror this idea. So here, bishop b4. So if any ideas of c6 come now, we go back with the knight right here to the c3 square, which I mentioned before. We're still honing in on the b5 and the d5 squares, and it looks like we're still going to have an idea of a c5 break at some point. But black played something completely different, which if we look at it, so this knight is here. It's threatening to potentially come here at some point and continue a kingside attack. But black essentially negated all chances of that happening by placing the queen over here earlier, and these pieces such as the rook and the bishop never really have a chance of getting over there anymore. If an f4 pawn push comes at any point, this pawn suddenly becomes weaker right here, right? So here we just break with c5, so we're looking to fragment the pawns like I said before. So this looks like it works, but we can induce a little Zwischenzug, an in-between move. So we're just going to take, knight takes, queen moves back, but as we look, the pin's still there, so we're going to be able to recapture with the knight, pawn's going to have to recapture, and then if we look at that, we've got an isolated b pawn, and we'll have an isolated c pawn, d pawn right after that. So knight comes out, we're going to go there, and bishop just drops back. We are opening up all the space for these lovely pair of rooks and this queen here, so we're just going to hammer down the b and the c files here with no worries, and essentially one of these pawns is going to fall. So black started to get under time pressure here, so he played rook f c8. So this basically just drops a pawn. So black is a queen up here, so obviously we cannot take first. So what we have to do is we proceed with the take first. We get rid of any tension between the pieces, especially these rooks here. We induce a recapture, and white has finally got his piece back, his pawn. So black comes down here. We induce a little check here first to make sure that this bishop loses all of its scope and is restricted against movement here. So bishop drops back, and essentially both of these pieces are locked out of the game for the next 2-3 moves at least, while either a g6 or an h6 idea comes so that the king can jump out from behind the pawns here. Now in the meantime, we're going to go king f1, and essentially this position is more or less equal, but it's far easier for white to play. He has ideas to go for this idea along the d pawn, and he's essentially going to attempt to break with f3 at some point, well, noticing that this knight still hits the e3 square. So ideally, what he's going to do is also bring his king out here. Now at this point, black was under severe pressure and blundered a whole piece, so I will not show that. But this is the game, and I just wanted to show how piece activity can be important, more important even than material, such as a pawn. So if you can, sacrifice material to gain a positional advantage and be able to take advantage of files with your rooks along the b and the c files, as I mentioned before. So this is my first video, and thanks for watching.